Recording for us. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Cradle to Career Governance Manual Ad Hoc Committee meeting. I see that we have 4 of our board members who are part of the Ad Hoc Committee present, so thank you so much for volunteering to help with this effort. And a few others also have joined us today, so welcome. We'll go ahead and begin with an overview of the agenda for today's meeting. On to slide 3. Let's see. So today we'll be discussing the process that we are going to use to amend and make changes to the governance manual. We'll walk through the list of topics for revisions that were suggested by board members in our last meeting. And then, of course, we will have time for public comment and some future dates for upcoming meetings. All right, so that gets us to this process for editing the governance manuals. One of the things that we've all probably gotten used to are these virtual meetings, which perhaps offers us great benefits, such as being able to attend even more meetings without the travel time that's needed for those in-person meetings. And I sometimes prefer having these virtual meetings. However, with the changes to Bagley-Keene for the pandemic, those were temporary and they will expire. And so that means that we will have to meet in person after the end of this month, anytime that there are more than 2 board members involved. And so this is in the interest of transparency and open government and ensuring that we are creating trust, which is so important in our work. The process noted here for editing the governance manual, I believe, strikes this balance between, scheduling and noticing and conducting public meetings with an iterative process for, a smaller working group that is tasked with actually editing the document before it comes to the public group for additional comment and action. So the process that we'll use, we'll go ahead and start today with a discussion to gather direction on the proposed edits. So, for example, board members, what is our approach in addressing a particular topic? Staff will then make the edits based on that input from this group. We'll have 2 liaisons from the ad hoc committee that will work directly with Cradle-to-Career office staff to review and refine the edits in a small group working meeting. The 2 liaisons will then provide feedback, and that meeting has been scheduled for April 11th. The ad hoc committee would then review the proposed edits in a public in-person committee meeting on April 25th. So that meeting's been scheduled for 10 o'clock to noon in person here in Sacramento. Next slide, number 5. The revisions, they will be made public 10 days in advance to ensure, that openness that I talked about earlier. The public has an opportunity then to provide input before a final draft is presented to the full board. And with that, what I'd like to do is to ask a couple of our members, Chris Friuli and Gavin Payne, to serve as our liaisons. During the work group planning discussions, Chris was adept at bringing forth nuances in a variety of topics and helping us to work through them. His experience as part of that planning process, I think, will be a helpful bridge in updating the governance manual. Gavin has also served on many public boards, and in particular, I think that his experience with the state board and its operations will be very helpful to this group. So, assuming they are agreeable, yes? Thumbs up. I saw Gavin's thumbs up. Chris? All right, thumbs up. Thank you so much. Thank you for helping us to lead.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute, but yes, thumbs up.
I was having the same issue. Glad to help.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you guys will be our liaisons. All right, so then we will go ahead and move on to the list of topics that are going to be discussed today. I'm going to hand it over to Kathy to help facilitate that discussion so that we all can participate.
Hello, everyone. For those of you that weren't involved in our planning process before the creation of the Office of Cradle-to-Career Data, I was the lead facilitator. I work with WestEd. And so what I'll be doing here today is just making sure that we get solid notes about the expected changes to the governance manual. So this is a draft, just to, again, to give some background, that was basically created during the planning process. So the document encapsulates a lot of the recommendations that came out of the various entities that were involved in planning, which included both representatives from the data providers, as well as many of the people that will be using the data created by the new data system. And so then at our last meeting of the governing board, everyone took a look at the first draft. It's a very big document if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, and agreed to adopt it as with the understanding that it's a living document. It's something that's going to be amended continuously over the time that the data system is in existence. And really its intention is to help create some basic understandings about the way the board is going to be doing its work, whether that's the governing board or the two advisory boards that are being created right now. So it doesn't set any hard and fast rules, but rather we were using the analogy, it's like the manual in your car to basically understand where do you go to get particular types of information and how do things work. And so in that discussion in our last governing board meeting, there were 8 topics that got surfaced that probably need to be included in the governance manual in this first iteration. And so what I want to do is first just go through that list of topics and see if there's other things that people would like to add. And then we'll go one by one and get the feedback from our ad hoc committee members about whether there are specific recommendations of what they want to see in the governance manual related to these topics. So the first question that got raised is, okay, so this is a living document. How often are we going to amend it? So we probably want to create some guidelines with expectations for the frequency of amendments. The second topic is how we're going to establish quorum when we have meetings. That wasn't expressly spelled out. We definitely have some information from the Bagley-Keene regulations that we need to take into account for that. The next thing is sort of like, how are we going to set about scheduling meetings, sort of who's responsible for that? How do we figure out how frequently they happen and how long they last, so that we've got some sort of input for how the staff could then work with board members to set those meetings up. Then moving from sort of logistics, we have a cluster of issues that are around the key roles on the governing board. So there is not any specific guidance about how we go about nominating board chairs or when specifically in a calendar year that would occur. So we probably want to make that a little bit more specific. And then in the governance manual, there was the expectation that you'd have a seated board chair like Amy is right now. And then there would be the incoming board chair that would be elected, and they would run alongside the board chair for about a year. But we hadn't yet determined the division of responsibilities between the current and incoming board chair. So we might want to spell some of those things out. And then moving to the more work that is related to the board is, do we want to have standards or protocols for board members to follow if they get media requests? We want to set some guide rails around how ad hoc committees will actually be formed. When do they get brought forward to the board? What information is presented to the board at the point that we're going to create an ad hoc committee? And then our final topic, and this is a very different one for grain size, is how is it that we would evaluate new data providers that might be added to the data system? And then what does that mean related to how those folks would be fit into the governing board? So those were the 8 topics that got surfaced in our earlier discussions. Are there any other topics that you want to make sure that we address in our discussion?
Actually, Kathy, before we go on and consider some additional topics, so just a couple of comments on the list itself. So for the board members that are present today, I just wanted to remind you all that Sydney went through a doodle poll process in which we were identifying, what months of the year, what weeks of the month, which days of the week, all of that good stuff for board meetings. So we're not intending to change those board meeting dates through this process necessarily. So that would be one thing. I think that the other thing that I wanted to bring up was we had some really great questions coming from board members who were considering participating in ad hoc committees. And, to provide some clarity around what the task, the scope of work would be for each of the ad hoc committees. We've been in the process of developing sort of scope of work type documents or charters for these ad hoc committees. And the hope is that we'll continue to do that. So my hope is that, that will work its way in as well. And then, as you noted with the grain size of the last item, so I want to acknowledge that it is a really important item, flag for the group, that I think this might be an item that we may want to undertake at a later date. I've noticed that particularly with the work group meetings, whenever we come upon a decision that is tied to sort of unknown parameters, things that may change wildly or unexpectedly, I think people have a much more difficult time homing in on what is the best or the right decision. And so we're going to, give everyone the opportunity to formulate their thoughts on, the implications for, the government board size, how we'd add new data providers when that opportunity presents itself to the Cradle-to-Career data system, which I feel that is a little ways off from this initial startup period that we're in right now. We actually do have a whole lot that we're undertaking and starting to work on. So that would be what I would say for number 8, is just to flag that it is a very significant item, and recommend that this group defer working on it.
Chris.
Yes, thank you. I just have a couple of questions for clarification about scope and charge of this committee. The governance manual, are we supposed to be focusing on how the board operates and conducts business? Or is this broader than that, and how the system operates and implements what's in the authorizing legislation for Cradle-to-Career from a broader perspective? Because most of these fit into that into the former category about how the board operates. But as Amy mentioned, the last one on the list is broader about how the system sort of functions and operates. And I would, just as a point of clarification for number 8, when we do get around to taking this up, I would expand this to how the system expands, both in terms of new data providers and in terms of what it is collecting and seeking to collect from existing data providers. Because that is prescribed in the authorizing legislation, but it's not clear how the board or the managing entity or the system in general would approach that if and when it comes to that type of expansion. So I would add that to the list. But so I'm trying to get a sense of, are we talking just about the board? Or are we talking about the system in general? Like, for example, number 6, is it only how board members handle media requests, or is it how anyone within the Cradle-to-Career system handles media requests?
I think that particular item is specific to board members. The way that the governance manual is currently structured is set up to support the various different entities that are part of the Cradle-to-Career data system. So it's really in support of how those different groups, whether it's the data partners, the managing entity, and the various different the other groups that are listed in there, how the expectations for how they're to work together, I think, is the best way to say that, as opposed to the data system itself. I believe that there's a number of other documents, for example, the legal agreements and so forth, that are really separate from that. And Kathy, I think during the last board meeting, you talked about really kind of that separation of what the governance manual is versus, the operations of the data system itself.
What it presented on was a continuum of what other states have done as they're coming up. So there's this term that gets used in longitudinal data systems called data governance. And it's very confusing because some of it is the really big high level stuff, like how do we make decisions together? And some of it is incredibly granular about how do we do this particular procedure related to a piece of technology. And so the way that a governance manual fits into this is that it is the least binding of all of the documents that are created. So this is probably not the place where you want to interpret statute in a way that is strictly limiting about how anything's going to happen. This is not a set of bylaws. And so this really is the guidance to members of the governing board, advisory boards, and staff to understand how to work together, as Amy indicated, when you're looking at what other states have done. But we wanted to make sure that all of the issues that got addressed that had not yet been determined in the planning process got described. So another good way to look at that when you pull something off and have a different document to clarify intent, is there were a lot of questions in the last board meeting about the process by which researchers could request data if they wanted to perhaps do a study or evaluate a very particular intervention. And we clarified that there was a whole very elaborate policy that got developed for that during the planning process, which is why it's not here in the board manual. However, there was one topic that did not get fully fleshed out in the planning process, which was about how to expand to other data providers and what that meant for the governing board, which is why it showed up on this list. Gavin. Oops, you're still muted.
So I'm always muting myself. What's the deal with that? The sort of following on with Chris, my sense is that this is going to be a sort of a continuum activity sort of along the way. Right, so the board is responsible for operating the system, or responsible for the policy decisions that drive what staff does with some legislation. We're going to have a number of items that we have to place in the right buckets, Kathy's buckets, as she sort of identified them at the last meeting for clarification's sake. Some stuff's just going to be policy things that we decide as a board. Most of the topics on this list today are, I think, exactly that. Some of that we're going to have to do regulations, and and regulations will have to be prepared by the team to come back to the board. And I do think that this ad hoc is, as we evolve and as we go, can handle any number of those things in the right buckets at the right time, to the point of sort of, it's not the right time for us to be talking about item number 8. And I do think, to Chris's point, it is a sort of it's a management of the system activity, much larger question than sort of adding a new data provider into the issue. And that's going to have to be governed by pretty strict rules that are farther along in the binding part of the continuum. My basic point is that I think this is a yes and. As we get better at this, and as we go down the road, as issues arise, and as we think of the issues ourselves.
Were there other clarifying questions that people had about sort of the task at hand? Okay, are there any other topics that you'd like to see us discuss today? All right, shall we dig in? And if anything comes up along the way and you think, wait a second, I do want to add a topic, just go ahead and shout it out. Oh, Gavin, what were you going to say?
No, I just unmuted because we might be talking.
Okay, great. All right, let's start with the first item, which is the timing for amending the manual. So there's a couple of ways you could go about this. You could say it can be amended at any point. You could establish a fixed time frame, like there's always a review of the manual at the end of the calendar year or at the end of the fiscal year, with revisions intended in the following meeting. What's your preference for this?
So I'll start. I think it's appropriate for us to have a conversation at least annually, but probably not more than that in terms of the manual activity. It's the manual itself in terms of activities. As I talked about earlier, other things might come to us in sort of different timing in different parts of the year, but like sort of the evaluation of the executive director, the sort of the setting goals and objectives and activities, is sort of an annual review of whether or not the manual needs to be adjusted, and then how, I think, is appropriate.
I concur with Gavin's remark regarding an annual review of the governing manual. If you consider that we meet roughly quarterly, then we'll go through an entire cycle of maybe 4 meetings together. That'll afford us an opportunity to determine whether the governing manual is allowing us to move forward in the right direction. So annually seems to be appropriate.
I like that also.
Yeah, I would agree with that. My only thought was whether, given that we have sort of a 5-year phase-in build out of Cradle to Career, would there need to be more frequent revisions or reviews during that period, and then, less frequent beyond that? But I think annual sounds about right to me. I would agree with Gavin on that.
I would agree, annual at a minimum. And depending on how this governance manual is used, as Kathy stated, it's a living document, and it is guidelines for how we're handling things. I think we should reserve the possibility that we may need to talk about it more than annually at some point.
So annual is sort of the floor, at least annually it's going to be reviewed.
Sounds right.
So Gavin, you benchmarked to a couple of other type of activities like the ED review or sort of the review of the work of the year. Does that lead you to think that there's a particular time frame within the year when we should be looking at the governance manual in particular?
That's a great question. You certainly don't want to do it at the same time you're doing the ED review, because you're doing sort of goals and objectives and deliverables and all that kind of stuff. So one or two meetings before or after, I think, is probably appropriate, because perhaps issues come up during that review process and the goal setting process. So I would say perhaps the quarterly meeting after the review of the sort of the annual review of the ED and goals and setting and all that kind of stuff. Hey, Mari, can I just add a piece of clarification?
Sure.
I don't wear the data quality campaign hat for this activity per se.
Okay, thank you.
Just call me Gavin.
Okay.
And then Kathy, I was just noticing during the conversation, I think we got a thumbs up from Meredith Lee. We were having the conversation about it annually as well.
Thank you. Do others agree with Gavin that we sort of set this at the meeting after we finish the review of the work of the system and the ED?
That makes sense to me, Kathy, because once you set the goal and once you determine the direction that the executive director is going to be leading the organization, the question is then going to be whether the way that we're structured as it's manifested by the governing manual is going to be able to support and facilitate the accomplishment of those goals. So I think it's appropriate to do it maybe thereafter.
I saw a thumbs up from Amy on that. And from me. Okay, are you ready to move on to the next question then? Seeing some nods. Okay, so the next is how quorum is going to be established. And in this, I want to just interject because, Bagley-Keene is a very complex set of rules, and we were living under a very different set of rules during the pandemic. So one of the things to note that is really different than what was happening before is that you have to be in person in order to be counted toward quorum when the executive order expires at the end of this month. So just one of the things that you would need to know is that we have that new requirement. The other thing that's important to know is that in the legislation, it's saying that decisions have to be made by 2/3 of the membership, not who's present. And so that does create some wobble about what we consider quorum to be, because you could meet, but you could not take a vote if you had fewer than 14 people. So with those complexities in mind, and I will invite Ron Marriott, who's the attorney associated with C2C, if I stray at all from the specifics of Bagley-Keene, what is your thought then about how this group establishes quorum? In this group, I mean the governing board. My apologies, not the ad hoc committee. Would you want to set it at 14 as being quorum?
Is it an open question, or are we asking, or is someone supposed to be giving us advice on this one?
Oh, what a good point, Gavin. So you all can say, like, I would like a lifeline at this point and say, I don't know how to evaluate this. And we can identify other people that could maybe give us some insights, because again, we're not the only body that's trying to navigate the return to the old Bagley-Keene rules.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple things. So operationally, Bagley-Keene requires a majority is to be able to convene a meeting, and that is a quorum. I don't know if we can set a number that's different than that. Obviously, if we set a quorum and I have a meeting of 12 people and we can't make any decisions, we can put them off, but we can also hear testimony and have a formal meeting and just put off the decision. So my vote would be a quorum. A quorum would be a majority, and I think I probably speak for everybody on the board to say that they're all going to show up all the time. The second part of the equation too is that I do recall in certain instances where we would be able to obtain permission under Bagley-Keene to do board members from a remote location. There's lots of rules that apply to that. There's sort of lots of things, lots of hoops that you have to jump through in terms of public noticing and that kind of thing. With a board the size of ours, that would be fairly quickly sort of unwieldy, but I think there is going to be, we do have some relief for that if there's an extenuating circumstance, even if we set it at a majority and people can't get there in person. The only other thing that I wonder is, and this is to the staff and the team, in case you've heard anything, and there are a number of places where this is an active conversation in the legislature about modifying these rules in keeping with what we've learned over the last 2 years with COVID. And I'm just wondering if anybody's hearing about how those rules might look, or if that really is an active conversation.
If you'd like me to chime in, this is Ron Marriott, General Counsel for Cradle-to-Career, and as part of my responsibilities, once a month I'm on with General Counsel from throughout the state, including some of the people who are in charge of monitoring pending legislation. It's almost a month since the last meeting, but at the last meeting, the legislative push to liberalize the Bagley-Keene rules to provide for something like Zoom was, quote, dead in the water at that time, which was considered unfortunate. There are lots of public benefits to having increased participation, et cetera, via Zoom. But as of the last report, which is now almost a month old, the legislative push to liberalize the Bagley-Keene rules was looking like it was going to end in failure. So that's what I know, which is about a month old.
Thank you for that.
If I can just add one more thought to what Ron mentioned, just to clarify. So everything that Kathy was describing is true for the board members, needing to be there in person, with the nuance that you added, Gavin. We as C2C will choose to continue to broadcast our meetings on Zoom for the public to be able to participate and be there, even if they're not physically in Sacramento. So we can choose to do that. That doesn't change the requirement for board members to be there in person, but our community and everyone who wants to be a part of this can participate as they did during the Zoom during the pandemic, and being able to listen in during the meetings on Zoom. So we plan to continue to do that and just make that choice. That does not have implications for these questions around quorum, obviously, and attendance for board members.
I really appreciate that, and I applaud that move.
So we had a proposal basically from Gavin that we should just say a quorum is the majority, because that does give the opportunity to hear testimony, even if we're not making a decision. So do others agree that quorum should be a majority?
Does that mean 50% plus one?
Yes.
So in that case, what would that be here of 21 members?
11.
Yes, Kathy's math is right. The current 21 member board 11 would be a quorum under that framework.
And so we would be able to have a meeting, having established quorum, but we would not be able to take a vote, essentially.
So should we just, is there anything else that people want to state other than that we make that explicit and even include the math? Although I would like to believe that all people are math people. Some may feel worried about that.
I mean, Kathy, I would vouch for being explicit about it for those who might feel challenged about conducting the math themselves. But I do think that being able to carry on the meeting and allowing for public testimony and hearing what citizens in California are looking for the governing body to consider, even if they're not taking action, is going to be crucial. And it seems to be upholding sort of the spirit of the entire structure of the Cradle-to-Career office, including the the advisory boards and everything like that. So it seems reasonable to me to adopt that.
Absolutely, I agree.
Well said.
Ready to move on to meeting scheduling.
Let's just pause and give ourselves credit for being extra efficient today.
Great. So what we were looking for related to meeting scheduling, first of all, clarifying that it's going to be C2C staff, namely the board liaison, that will take on this activity. So it's not something that falls on, for example, the shoulders of the board chair. So I don't know, as Amy mentioned, Sydney put together this fantastic strategy for being able to attend to all the complexities of scheduling. Do you want to basically just enshrine what she did that allowed us to really find a time that worked well for everybody, with the idea that this would happen at the beginning of each year so that everyone knows well in advance what the meeting dates are? Or is there another approach that you would want to take?
I think that, if we could be just completely honest with everyone to say, when we schedule these dates that we're expecting, 8 hours of your schedule to be clear, six hours of your schedule to be clear, whatever that number is, I think that would be helpful. Because for some people, I think that unless they have that long lead time, perhaps, scheduling that much consolidated time might be difficult. And especially as we get to additional actions that need to be taken, ensuring that we have the right number of people to hold those votes is going to be really important. So
I had a quick question along those lines, and that is, should a governing board member have a conflict? Is there a provision in there to send a backup?
So yes, we have a process for naming, and Ron's going to correct me if I get this wrong, an alternate, or it could be a designee. I forget the correct term. That person has to be sworn in, and they are subject to the same conflict of interest rules. And only one of those people is allowed to vote, sort of serve as the official representative. So you could have a scenario in which both the official person and this designee are also at a meeting, but you have to be clear which of them is speaking for that role. Ron, did I miss anything about what we have clarified thus far?
The manual provides for an alternate singular for the members. So otherwise, yes, that was all accurate. I would just like to emphasize that it is an obligation, swearing in, the disclosures that required when assuming office, when leaving office. So it's not the type of thing that should be, in my view, undertaken on a per meeting basis, bringing a new alternate. Generally speaking, a member would want to have an alternate with which the member was entrusting the the obligation and responsibilities. So it is an obligation and there are responsibilities.
Could I just have a point of clarification? The statute's pretty explicit about who and which are allowed to do designees. and it doesn't speak to others of us. So for instance, it doesn't speak to my appointed position, whether I'm able to name an alternate in that instance. So this is something actually I think we're going to have to clarify going forward, whether I have a too narrow an interpretation of what that means or not. But I do think it might expose us at some point if we're not pretty clear about all the members and how exactly that they can designate or cannot designate a participant other than themselves.
Now, I'm sorry, Ron, did I hear you correctly on the obligation and responsibility piece that it's a responsibility for all of the seats to name an alternate or designee, just in case that the primary is unable to attend?
No, I'm sorry, and I understand how what I said could have been misinterpreted. No, there is no obligation for any member to appoint an alternate. But what I meant to say was, if an alternate is appointed, it comes with obligations and responsibilities.
Because I'm wondering if it would be in the best interest, especially in the interest of ensuring quorum, that every seat be obligated to name and swear in an alternate to expedite the substitution process in the case that the board member is unable to attend. I don't know if that's something that is practiced or common among boards.
So one thing that the staff can do is take a look and see if there are some other examples that we could point to. But I could see something where the manual makes very clear that because we have this constraint that we require 14 votes to make anything happen for decisions, that it's very important that there is clarity about how the alternate role functions, what's required of that individual. It could make a recommendation that entities preemptively have that role ready to go. I think one of the things we learned about COVID, though it's always been true, is that people get sick and sometimes, they just can't be where we expect them to be. And then getting some clarification maybe from the governor's office and the legislature about who gets to appoint the alternate. So for those of you who are less familiar with the specifics of it, the state agencies that are data providers are given the authority that the head of those agencies determine who represents their agency on the board. But there's also positions that are appointed by the Senate, by the Assembly, and by the governor's office. And so we can check in with them and sort of see what their preference is.
Yeah, so I do think that one's going to we're going to have to be really explicit and specific about that too. Just for example, I sat as a designee for my former boss on CalSTRS, but that was a whole process as Ron identified of sort of doing that. But I was the designee and sort of no one else, and there wasn't provision for an alternate if I couldn't make it. It was either the boss or me. Conversely, the State Board of Education, our governor's appointees, there is no provision at all for them to say, I can't make this meeting, my buddy or my friend, either the governor or that board member to make a substitution of themselves. And so we'll have to be really clear about that in terms of our exposure and the decisions that we make.
Kathy, if I may add, I think from a principal standpoint, what we would like to do, what I would like to see is for us to be sort of aligned. So whether you're a data provider or you're one of the appointees, that there's the ability to have an alternate. So here we have in the manual the use of the word alternate. In the legislation, the wording is designee. So perhaps we can just clarify that what our intention is to afford both types of board members that ability to have somebody act on their behalf, so that we can kind of move forward with votes and so forth.
The one comment I would add on this issue is that we want to make sure, especially with the composition of the governing board, to ensure parity across all of the members. And if that is indeed one of the core principles, which it's been laid out that that's what we want, then we want to make sure that the designee process or what have you is taking all of that into consideration. I think the other factor here is, given just the limited number of meetings that we have already, and the fact that we need such a substantial number of votes to get anything moving forward, we don't want to be in a situation where we're continuously at the mercy of full attendance by everyone. Otherwise, we're not reaching quorum and not able to act. And then it puts, the work of the entire staff in peril. And then the only other consideration I guess I would have here is, actually, no, this last point is related to a different topic. So yeah, I'll close my notes there.
Any other thoughts about meeting scheduling, establishing alternates, ensuring parity between data providers and appointees? Anything else?
And I think just on the scheduling piece, I think as far in advance as we can decide to set the meeting schedule for the next year, we have an obligation to the public, especially, to be able to set those meetings. And then you're also putting sort of your fellow board members on notice that these are the obligations and this is when, and plan accordingly, sort of at the beginning of the year or in November for the following year, something like that.
That actually raises an interesting point. When we say year, this is one of these things that has many possible interpretations because we have fiscal years and academic years and calendar years. So we started, theoretically with a fiscal year. But in fact, we did not have all the legislation in place until September to sort of create the Office of Cradle-to-Career Data or get everyone appointed. What is your starting point for a year in your mind?
That's a tough one because its budget year is one governing, and that's sort of been smack dab in the middle of the year. But then any legislation, unless it's urgency, takes place on the January of the year, and the legislative calendar starts in the January of the year. So I think we just sort of have to pick one and see how it works. I would suspect agency would prefer, staff would prefer if we started it in the in sort of budget year, mid-year, so July 1.
I sort of suspect that would be true also because, the annual reporting that we would need to do would align with the dollars, which are then fiscal year driven.
So using July 1 and giving that as our start date. Okay, seeing a lot of nods. Great. Okay, so our next thing is about the process and timing for nominating board chairs. So we're all on the same page. What happened is that Amy was the only one who ran this time, so it made it really easy. And there might have been a few people saying, please, please, run for this because Amy was so involved in the planning process. So we want to have something more formal in the future. So what is your recommendations? Let's go start with timing. So would we want to have the board chair start with that idea of the beginning of the fiscal year, so July 1? I feel like go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable, Kathy, because if we're starting the work of the scheduling and all of that stuff, then it makes sense to have all of those align.
Yes, I agree. That makes sense.
Okay, seeing agreement on that. So then what is the process? In essence, what we actually did was an open call this last time. So do we just have a procedure where people put in their recommend? So let's think about this. So if you start at the beginning of the fiscal year, and then people have a full year to run alongside the current board chair. So does that mean it's the first meeting in the fall when people would indicate their interest, or would you actually back it up and have it be the last meeting in a fiscal year where people could put in applications and then there's a vote so that they can start in the beginning of the fiscal year?
I sort of have a question for the appointed board members. When would they know that they are serving on a new term? When do their terms sort of cycle?
I don't know that that was ever expressly laid out. So there's wording in the legislation that indicates that there's a staggering of initial terms. So some of the appointees are serving for less time so that we could get to the staggering, but theoretically everyone would be really clear exactly what their term is with this July 1 start date. And we would just work backwards from there with the legislature and the governor's office to get the appointees in time.
Yeah, my sense is that appointees are going to come at all different times during the year, depending on who's taking action when. And that I don't know if we could govern the election process by when folks get appointed as we go. I guess my only suggestion is sort of generally, at the risk of, I feel like I'm the first to speak, so I'll just shut up after this. I guess my suggestion would be to have a sort of a board chair and a board vice chair that would be the sort of the person in waiting, and you elect them at the same time, knowing that you would then cycle the vice chair as well as the chair. So then you have relief if for some reason the board chair can't make a meeting, and you've established that. And then secondly, you've got that you've sort of established that that's the sort of the line of conveyance. I guess my suggestion would be to have that election at the meeting immediately prior to the start of the fiscal year. So everything starts fresh. You go, you have new leadership, you go forward and move on from there. But I haven't sort of lined all those things up in my head yet about sort of a evaluation, board set sort of goals and objective setting and that kind of thing. So we may be lumping too many things into that mid-year meeting.
That would be May, is that right?
I'm seeing nods, yeah.
Amy, do we have a process right now for events in which you're absent, for example, about how a meeting gets convened?
I think we're handling that on the fly, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So hence I think I was probably the one to raise this as an issue to talk about.
And maybe all the more reason than to have a vice chair or something to that effect. I mean, that is obviously one priority, because if we can't operate in the absence of a particular leader's presence, then we would put ourselves in a precarious situation. I think the other is we want to consider some way of sustainability and continuity. So that's my only other consideration. I don't have a particular suggestion right now, but I think a core principle that we want to take into account, that there is some process by which we're considering how things will get transitioned from one chair to another.
So we're all on the same page about timing. The board chair is a 2-year position. So we have the idea of the incoming chair that has an overlap. But the idea of asking someone to run, knowing there'll be 2 years in which they will not be chair, and then they're going to be chair for 2 years. Maybe it's just me. I feel like it's harder to plan for the future than I once thought. So one possibility is that we could do something where we have an incoming chair that overlaps for a year. And we have an outgoing chair that stays on sort of as the alternate on the other side, so that there's sort of a longer spread that is still 4 years, because you'd go a year in, 2 years on, and a year sort of in that mentoring role. So it makes a bigger commitment for the board chair, but I've seen that model work in some other board structures. What do you think?
I think that's very common. I've seen it quite a bit as well.
Like the immediate past president kind of thing, yes.
Okay, so we can try that approach. And then the responsibilities of the incoming or outgoing board chair. So I'm hearing that we want to have that person as the alternate to help lead meetings if the current board chair can't make it. What other responsibilities? So some of the other things that we know that the board chair does is that they oversee the executive director evaluation. They help to lead the meetings that happen. They help to keep communications going with other board members. Should actually go look at the manual, make sure that I'm remembering all of the responsibilities. what of those things are would be right for the non-active board chair to follow? Amy, what would you want to hand off if you could?
Well, I'm sort of wondering about, the communications piece, because I think it is a really important piece. And I think that that is something that needs to be coordinated with the ED and the C2C staff. So I'm wondering if there's perhaps some alignment there, that the incoming chair help to assist with, communications, whether that's media inquiries and assisting the executive director or the director of communications within Cradle-to-Career, so that we have a small group that's sort of collaboratively working.
I'm going to put into chat the specific responsibilities of the board chair so that everybody can take a look at it together. I'm going to make sure that this is pasted appropriately. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to run through the list for those who are listening and can't see the screen. So they facilitate board meetings and set the agendas. They act as the governing board's primary point of contact with the executive director. They onboard new governing board members, and then they convene the ad hoc committees like this one, and then the annual review of the ED. So those are the primary responsibilities. So that may make it easier to think about what goes forward. So Amy suggested that communications, external communications, is one area of responsibility that could go to the person who's not the acting board chair. What other items here do you think are appropriate for those non-board chair pre and post positions?
I would think that the onboarding of new board members would be appropriate for the incoming chair, given that they would likely be serving under that person's chairship. It could help build that relationship and
Yeah, I agree.
help facilitate the incoming chair's movement into that role in collaboration with future board members.
Great.
And the only other place, at least the place that came to my mind immediately, was sort of the convener of subcommittees and ad hoc committees might be a role as well. I probably have a more fundamentally different view of the communications and whose role is what in that. So when we have that part of the conversation, or are we having that part of the conversation?
We will be talking about communications.
Okay.
Next.
Got it. But I mean, sort of that, if you're the convener because if we've got all these ad hoc committees and we have a number of them, and we have the advisory board members as well, asking the chair to be the convener of all of those is, I think, asking a lot.
I would agree with that. I think convening the ad hocs would also be a good way to develop that in the incoming chair when it's time to facilitate the full board.
Yeah.
To build on that, Kathy, thanks for pasting the roles. That flagged for me that an outgoing alternate chair role would be offboarding. So building in some time for reflection, exit interviews, that type of thing. This is Meredith. Sorry, my bandwidth is not great today.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you, Meredith.
I think it's a pretty good.
And I would just in terms of I like the idea of the immediate past president model as well. And, given that person will have served, several years in a leadership role in Cradle-to-Career, leveraging that person's reputation and credibility as sort of a cheerleader for the system somehow could really could benefit the system, I think, and work well with that person's role.
Any other thoughts on this topic? Great. Let's go on to handling media requests. So Gavin, it seemed like you had some larger thoughts. Do you want to just share those for starters?
Yeah, so fundamentally for me, the job of handling and managing media requests is the job of the staff, most particularly Marianne and her team. And we as board members should be deployed against that, not as a sort of separate entity that does media activities. And in my view, at least, it's just the job of the board chair to be the spokesperson for the organization and the entity, if asked to do that by the staff. And it's like one of those things you just really want to manage that tightly. And the team is the one that have absolute currency in what's going on and all that kind of stuff. And they probably are sort of well trained in how this stuff comes across the transom. And it should all derive from Marianne and her team.
Yeah, I would second that.
I agree with that as well, but I think we need to clarify what that means operationally. Does that mean we refuse all media requests, or does that mean we don't actively pursue them, or what does that mean for board members?
Well, I think
I guess because that's the right. So to your point, I think, Chris, the sort of the incoming, what if you get a call? I think you just route it through the chair to the team, and they figure out, how and what needs to get responded to and how, and we'll deploy you against that, even though the contact came into you.
Yeah, I sort of feel like we should be having a consistent flow of the requests, right? So similar to what you talked about, Gavin, but I also want to make sure that, when the request is of the individual on behalf of their agency, that they're able to speak from that position, and not have to, as long as that's, very, very clear in the request, right? So you're being asked to speak on your behalf about what your particular organization is doing, as opposed to your role as a board member or the board on Cradle-to-Career or anything to do with Cradle-to-Career. So any of those kinds of requests would then flow to the board chair, then over to the staff to handle. Does that sound reasonable? Or did I just completely?
Well, so yeah, so for instance, even for instance, Chris, to use you as an example, and I apologize, but if a request came into you to speak on behalf of UC as a participant in something, whether it was Cradle-to-Career or something else, you have a whole process, I'm sure, internal to the organization about who you have to contact and what you have to do and get permission to sort of be that spokesperson, right? And sometimes it's you and sometimes it's not. I'm just sort of trying to describe the same sort of situation that would happen with regard to anything that is sort of Cradle-to-Career in orientation in terms of questioning.
So we're talking about the process here would be directing requests to the board chair and then to the executive director.
Yes.
Okay.
So the staff are handling it, right?
So maybe it would be to both the board chair and the ED at the same time. So like everyone's aware of what's going on, because
Right,
most press
both.
inquiries are time sensitive.
I think that's right. I think
Yeah.
that's right. So John Fensterwald calls me. I immediately send a note to Amy and Marianne and say, what am I doing? Here's the request. Do you want me to take it or not? And sort of go from there.
Got it.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that topic?
To build on that, this is Meredith. I do appreciate having some FAQs or talking points. I know Marianne had shared some before where we can be a bit proactive. And if there is something that, we could say in support of generally, and then pass it over to staff and so forth, that might be a better sort of experience for somebody contacting us. Just a suggestion.
And what about, I don't know if this is part of what we're talking about, but just in the course of our professional duties, presenting at conferences and in other public venues, speaking to Cradle-to-Career in any way, shape, or form as a board member. Does that also follow the same process of checking in with the board chair and the ED on that?
Yeah, if I guess my short answer is yes. If I'm going to be asked to speak about it, if I'm going to be asked to speak about Cradle-to-Career specifically, then I want to be able to make sure that they are aware that that's happening and that I have the latest information to be able to speak sort of appropriately to that. By the same token, there may be occasions when we want to go out and make presentations and do that sort of thing, and I would assume that by the same token we would coordinate closely with Marianne and Amy and getting all that ready to go.
Yeah, that's more what I was thinking of. Like if we were planning to do that in any way.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, and on the other side of that record, I would hope that they would ask us to do those sorts of things and be out there and be evangelists for the organization as well.
So then maybe to Meredith's earlier point, there may be times when it's useful for the staff and the board chair to work together to create FAQs and common messaging that we'd like to have everyone be hearing about the data system, and that the board members would know that they could contact the staff to get that type of information, sort of like the elevator pitch in a way.
There you
As an example.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Great suggestion.
That's great. And it also fits with some of our plans to create a couple of standard slides, common branding, logo, all of that stuff is all kind of on deck for our director of communications once they come on board. So it sounds like that will be a helpful resource combined with the process of ensuring everyone's coordinated and talks with each other.
I really like that, yeah.
Anything else on communications?
Just to amplify the points everyone else has made, I'm a really big proponent of coordinating, if not, actively ensuring that the executive director has authority or discretion over communications, because one of our jobs as a board is to ensure that the executive director is performing at the levels that we expect. And that is one of the core functions of an executive director. And if we are, as board members, too involved in that process, then we undermine the ability of the executive director to perform in the way that the board needs the executive director to perform.
Absolutely.
So in the event that Chris is presenting on Cradle-to-Career and he's run that by both Amy and Marianne, how would the rest of us, or do the rest of us need to know that that's happening? How would that be communicated out?
I have a suggestion, but again, I'm worried about monopolizing. One of the boards I sit on, and here I go, I'm just going to talk. One of the boards I sit on is the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. It's a big one. It's like this one. It's 20, 30 people, right? So, and everybody has lots of other hats that they wear and other things. And too, one of the things that that executive director does that I think is really good is she does a monthly blast that sends out the entire board who's been doing what on the board's behalf in the previous month. Obviously, we'll have to be good about sort of collecting that information, especially if it's something that happens off the cuff and we haven't already coordinated. But I think it's a really great mechanism to basically let us know who's been talking where about the national board and what we've been hearing and that kind of stuff. And that just sort of comes in a monthly check-in with board members themselves.
Yeah, or a great job for the comms director.
Indeed.
Okay, so I've got a bunch of really good ideas for how to flesh that out. So our next topic is how ad hoc committees will be formed. And again, I want to reinforce something that Amy said earlier, that we've been working on sort of a standard format of information that would be sort of pulled together before an ad hoc committee gets put together. So rather than have a scenario where you get to a meeting as a board member and someone's like, hey, we're going to have this committee. It's going to be fun. Do you want to join us? It'd be more like, we are going to be meeting 4 times in this time frame. You will be addressing these questions. Staff will be providing support in these ways. This is the expected outcome. So it gets very, very specific about what you're expected to do. Does that seem like a good approach for us to codify and put into the board manual?
Yeah, I would say so, Kathy. I like, for example, the ad hoc committee for the ad hoc committee description document for this particular committee, because it lays out the purpose, it lays out who the members are, it lays out a general timeline of the work. It's instructive, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is for the purposes of any board member who wishes to participate, it allows them to understand what the scope of work is and what the expectations are, so that they know that they can actually fulfill those responsibilities, including, for example, whether certain meetings are going to be in person or if they're going to be done by Zoom, right? Like we in real time, we were experiencing that with this particular committee because we shifted from one regime or paradigm to another. I think secondly, it is also crucial for the public to know and understand a general idea of what this ad hoc committee is supposed to be doing, so that they can properly evaluate whether it matches some of the recommendations being made by the community advisory board, the technical advisory board, and so on. And then third, I think it's also instructive for staff, because then it allows them to properly understand how they can leverage this ad hoc committee in support of the overall efforts of the organization. So I think for all of those reasons, it's good to codify it in the manual, and in particular as well, because again, it takes so much for us, so many votes, so many board members to achieve quorum and all of that stuff. The more organized we are about that process, I think we're all going to be better off for it.
Well said. Thank you.
One of the things that occurs to me when you're framing about how we make sure the public understands what the board is engaging in, is that we probably should then be indicating, like, these meetings are in person because we're under the Bagley-Keene rules, and this meeting is virtual because it's not, so that it doesn't feel just sort of random how things are done. Particularly, people are very interested in participating and are trying to figure out the format. So we could definitely have that in there as well. Anything else on ad hoc committees?
And will the proceedings and materials and deliverables of these be on the C2C website? Is that where people would look for them?
So let's spell this out, what it would look like in process. So if staff would create a charter with the board chair for what the ad hoc committee would be, and then it would be presented at a board meeting so everybody could see it and see what it was going to be. And then the next question is, what's public and what's not? So let's take the work of this committee. So in order to get us to, like, we're going to be in New Bagley-Keene land the next time we meet, which is why we have the 2 liaisons, so that we don't have to have an in-person meeting, so that Gavin doesn't have to drive up from the South Central Coast to come to the meeting. And so we have the way that this information is then brought to the public in the in-person meeting that comes after it. So I would think, based on what we did in the planning process, you probably want something where, as things are really cleaned up and we're getting ready for public comment, they would absolutely be on the website for everybody to see. But there might be some drafts that happen between where we're still working out wording that probably wouldn't be put on the website. So again, I'm reflecting what we did in the planning process as a possible proposal. Does that seem right for the level of transparency you would expect?
Yeah, I think so, but I think I was thinking more sort of looking back, where we have the body of work of these committees publicly available so that people can see how things got to be the way they are. So it's not just random how the system is evolved in such a way that it evolved out of recommendations from this committee that had this membership and met on these dates, kind of like what the iPED's technical review panels do, where you can go to a website and see the history of all the meetings and the recommendations that came out of it and what the membership was.
Is that what others would like to see happen for the work of the ad hoc committees? I'm seeing some nods.
And if I can just ask a clarifying question for Chris. So I think what I'm hearing you say right now, for example, we have a page on the website that's kind of a flow in terms of time of past board meetings and materials, and that we could, that especially as we grow and the body of work grows over time, with something organized a bit more like the WestEd planning website was, where there's then another page kind of organized topically, so that I can find, like, I wonder what was done on governance. And then you go there and here's all of the resources related to governance and different topics, so that people can kind of in real time see what was recent, what's coming up on one place, and then a different place that's kind of topically organized where people can understand the archive of the past. Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Just so it's transparent how decisions were made by whom and how they resulted in how the system is evolving and changing. But yes, that's basically what I'm thinking.
Okay, you ready to move on to our final item? So this is where we were saying that probably the process for adding new data providers is too big of a topic to be covered in this group. But it makes me wonder if we should have some express note in the board manual that says that this document, which serves largely to help clarify how the different entities work together, is supplemented by more formal policies and legal agreements, so that in the future people understand why the data request process isn't in the board manual and is somewhere else. Would something like that be useful?
I'm not sure I completely understood. Yes, so if what you're asking is, this is a sort of a larger, much more conscripted activity in terms of new data, new members in the system, it's probably a place that it's probably located appropriately in a place that's tighter than the governing manual. If you're saying, let's just make a notation that it's a topic for a future conversation that is sort of probably in front of the larger of the entire board or something like that. Does that make sense?
I think I wasn't clear. So the first part of what you said was exactly aligned with what I was trying to lay forward. I think I was thinking more generically. So what occurred to me as I listened to the discussion last time, that if you weren't following along for every moment of the planning process, it's easy to understand that you wouldn't
Right.
know that there were all of these other policies that had been created. And so when people were asking very reasonable questions, well, where has this been considered? That if we had a note in the governance manual that indicated where people should be looking for things that are more formal, because this is the least binding type of documentation,
I got you.
this might be easier for onboarding other people. And we don't have to list what all those policies are, but we can just speak thematically, is what I was thinking.
I think that's a great idea.
You mean, so when you say onboarding new people, you mean data providers?
Oh, I was actually thinking new board members.
Oh, okay. I thought you were speaking to number 8 here. I'm sorry. I was confused.
I was being too complex. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's break it down to make sure that I've got clarity about what you all have decided. So we've agreed that we are not going to try to tackle how we add additional data providers in the board manual.
Correct.
Got it. Yes.
And that would be well served to have a statement in the board manual that clarifies that it is supplemented by more formal policies and legal documents.
Agreed.
Policies, regs, yeah, exactly.
And then finally, are you recommending action now on deciding the process for new data providers, or are you going to recommend to your colleagues on the board that we wait until a later date?
Great.
I think I go with Chris's point, and that was it's way too soon as we're building this thing to bring new folks on, and it's a much bigger conversation that'll happen at the very earliest, probably 2 years down the road.
Would it require a statutory change?
That's a good question.
Legislation says that the board may add additional members and providers.
And in doing so, would that change the number, the quorum required to pass?
I think so.
Yes.
I mean, there's a whole lot that is behind this if we head down that path.
The implications are pretty immense, both for what gets added and how you deal with the process. Absolutely.
I mean, for all of these reasons that have just been shared right now, I think it's all the more reason to table it and not to have an ad hoc committee that's supposed to focus just on the governing manual to deal with it. It's a much broader topic that deals, it isn't even simply about data providers per se, but it's about the overall structure of the organization. And I think it would be most appropriate for it to be dealt with at the governing board level as opposed to at an ad hoc level. And if at a future point it is something that an ad hoc committee, not to say it's this one, but an ad hoc committee works on, then we'd want to ensure that the entire board provides some guidance and direction as to what that ad hoc committee should be exploring.
Great. So we are exactly on time. So Amy, do you want to open us up to public comment, or is there any final statements that members of the ad hoc committee want to make before we move on?
All right, great discussion. I'm not seeing hands up on the additional comments, so we'll go ahead and move to public comment. So members of the public, please go ahead and use the Zoom chat to chat Mari if you would like to make a comment of up to 2 minutes. Of course, if the number of speakers exceeds the time scheduled for this meeting, we'll go ahead and extend the meeting accordingly.
No one has contacted me during the meeting about public comment at this point.
Okay, in the interest of inclusion, let's go ahead and give a couple more minutes to have people formulate their thoughts. All right, any takers?
Yes, my name is Dr. Mark Jones. I'm Program Manager Education Specialist for DCFS in LA County. And I've been following along. I unfortunately had a meeting that blocked me and kept me from coming on time, but I got about half of the proceedings. And I wanted to speak in general to my appreciation for the development of the committee and the entire work of the governing board and the efforts to make this type of work move forward in a way that really benefits young people. I'm engaged in a process that supports system-involved scholars, both on the probation side and on the DCFS side, in being successful in school and supporting CSWs and SCSWs as they do the hard work day to day in ensuring that the education rights are met. We find that access to effective data and tools that connect are boundlessly meaningful. And the ways that we can be smart about that really support the effort statewide and as we move to departments as large as the DCFS, which is the largest Department of Children and Family Services in the United States. So with that in mind, I just wanted to speak to that. I did have a chance to look at the website, and I thought it was put together quite well. And I find an interest in the application part that talks about community advisory board. So I'm going to take a closer look at that. But just for the general purpose, I wanted to speak to my appreciation and my interest as I work in data systems that connect and support our system-involved scholars. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Okay, Mari, do we have any others?
No.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead and do a quick review of some action items. And we're going to go ahead. My notes is that we are going to go ahead and coordinate a meeting on April 11th, which will be a working meeting between Chris and Gavin, our liaisons, who will work with the Cradle-to-Career staff to work through the notes that Kathy has taken today to prepare a draft for the April 25th governance manual meeting. Am I missing any other action items? I think that was pretty much it. All right, with that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating and helping to make an impact. So we'll see you again soon. If there are no objections, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.